Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Larry Diamond. I'm the faculty co-director of the Haas Center for Public Service. On behalf of my Haas Center colleagues, I want to welcome you to the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor Lecture on Public Service in the University. Before I proceed, I want to thank heartily and profoundly my colleagues at the Haas Center, particularly our Deputy Executive Director, Megan Sweezy-Fogarty, who worked so hard on this event. Obviously, my colleague, our Executive Director, Tom Schnaubelt, my colleague as Faculty Co-Director, Julie Kennedy, and the amazing staff at the Haas Center who really have invested a great deal in this. I think we're innovating here a bit because today, in collaboration with the Stanford Alumni Association, we are webcasting this event to reach a global audience, which is perfectly fitting for our guest today. And I'd like to welcome all of you watching this event online, worldwide. Thank you for joining us as well. And we'll also post a video of this event on the Haas Center website. She doesn't like to be thanked much, but I want to thank Mimi Haas for her vision and generosity in working with us to establish this Distinguished Visitor Program, which has just been an incredible success. Each year bringing a prominent public service figure to Stanford for a 10-week residency, and we hit the jackpot this time. It's going to be a little longer with John, to engage with students, faculty, and our campus community. And I also want to recognize we kind of hit the jackpot in this way as well. We were lucky that our second incumbent of this role 2 years ago, the former administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Jane Lubchenco, has come to join us. Welcome back to campus, Jane. Later this year, the Haas Center will celebrate 30 years of inspiring and educating students to build a more just and sustainable world. We do this by supporting students to explore diverse pathways of public service and to prepare for lives of leadership and creative impact as engaged global citizens. And what a global citizen we have to present to you this evening. I asked John Githongo how he wanted to be introduced tonight. You didn't know I was going to inflict this back on you. He was typically direct and modest. He said, "I'm an anti-corruption and good governance activist." And indeed, he is. But that is a bit like saying that Nelson Mandela was an anti-apartheid activist or Malala Yousafzai is a campaigner for girls' education. These are the headlines, but they're only the beginning of the story. Through their courage, vision, and unshakable commitment to a cause, some individuals come at critical moments in history to embody an epic struggle for reform. Kenya is at a critical moment in its more than 50 years as an independent state, and the epic struggle that will determine its future is for good governance. It is a struggle for democracy, accountability, and the rule of law. It is a contest played out across the African continent, and indeed much of the world, between those who seek to monopolize power and wealth and those who want to constrain power in the service of development and social justice. Call it monopoly, in fact I do, but this is no board game. The stakes are life and death. Kenya's political landscape is littered, literally, with the bodies of many brave and forthright souls who sought to challenge this power monopoly and expose its corrupt machinations. That is why Michela Wrong's gripping account of this struggle, It's Our Turn to Eat, opens with that moment when this, quote, barrel-chested, trunk-necked lumberjack of a man, end quote, almost got himself killed as the wire he was wearing to record the corrupt plotting of two senior ministers tripped into playback mode and only John's quick thinking and contrived fit of coughing saved him from disaster. He has courted disaster repeatedly as he's proceeded to betray the venal ethnic power brokers who thought they could rely on him, and then to blow the whistle on the largest government scandal in Kenyan history, one that pointed all the way to the president himself. A decade after John Githongo, in his role at the time as Kenya's official anti-corruption czar, revealed the Anglo leasing scandal, no official, to my knowledge anyway, has been held accountable for a $750 million corruption scheme in which $250 million simply disappeared through an elaborate web of shell companies created for the sole purpose of looting the public treasury. And the seed, nevertheless, has been laid for a better future because civil society has been roused and inspired, and John Githongo is a major reason why. After graduating in economics and philosophy from the University of Wales in the UK, John returned to Kenya to work in his father's accounting firm. He would come to be a major advocate of accountability, but he never took to accounting, I understand. And he soon left the firm in what Michela Wrong would call, quote, the first in a series of jarring acts of revolt. He found his calling, as I think you know, in writing and investigating, as a journalist and commentator for major Kenya newspapers and magazines, which he continues to write for, as well as for The Economist magazine. In the 1990s, he was recognized as one of CNN's African Journalists of the Year. His biting reporting and commentary helped to bring an end to the corruption-drenched 24-year reign of President Daniel Arap Moi. So did his civic work as executive director of the Kenya chapter of Transparency International. In January 2003, he was appointed permanent secretary for governance and ethics by the newly elected president, Mwai Kibaki. It was a logical step. Kibaki had been democratically elected on an anti-corruption platform after the end of that long reign of Daniel Arap Moi, and Kenya seemed to be turning a new page. But I think you know what happened. Githongo resigned from that position just 2 years later, which is almost, I was fascinated to see, 10 years to this day. Word leaked that he felt the Kenyan government was not committed to fighting corruption and that he had received death threats. He took up a position as senior associate at St. Antony's College, Oxford. In 2008, he returned to Kenya to found Inuka Kenya Trust, a grassroots advocacy group aimed at creating an informed citizenry. 3 years later, he launched a new campaign. I hope I pronounce it right, John. Kenya Ni Yetu, Kenya is ours, aimed at mobilizing ordinary people to speak up against corruption, impunity, and injustice. He also chairs the board of the African Center for Open Governance, whose executive director, Gladwell Otieno, is a Draper Hill Summer Fellows alumnus of CDRL here at Stanford. And he is vice chair of the largest, I know he's very proud of this, he's vice chair of the largest amateur youth football league in Africa, the Matari Youth Sports Association, which combines soccer with environmental work, HIV/AIDS awareness, and leadership mentoring, and which has also been a repeated partner of our Designing Liberation Technology class at Stanford. Did you know that? So you see, John Githongo is not only a big man, a brave man, and a man widely admired by governance reformers throughout Africa. He is already a Stanford man. So John Githongo, welcome to the Haas Center.
Thank you very much, Larry, for those very, very kind words. I'm going to time myself here because sometimes I talk too much. Allow me to start by thanking Ms. Mimi Haas. Larry, again, for your very kind words. Thank you for the kind introduction. And the entire team at the Haas Center, Bill Murray and the entire team and also at the Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law, for making it possible for me to be with you here today. It's a double honor to be asked to deliver this lecture that I have tentatively titled Africa Rising or Uprising, Confronting the New Authoritarianism. I'm not an academic, though as people at home realized via Twitter that I have the honor to be the Mimi and Peter E. Haas and CDDRL Distinguished Visitor for 2015 at Stanford University, this news has been received with a mixture of alarm, excitement for those who are pleased for me, and good riddance for some of my interlocutors that I have accumulated over years in the anti-corruption field. Most of my professional life, I have worked in civil society, mostly focused on anti-corruption, in the media as a columnist, as a civil servant in the government of Kenya, and as an advisor to governments and the private sector on issues of governance generally. I continue to be seized by the general welfare of those in my country and the continent who have not had the good fortune that I have had. In that respect, it has been my singular privilege over the years to be allowed into the homes and lives of a vast cross-section of citizens in what has become the most enduring lesson of my life. This sharing with even those who have apparently so little to give, but whom you soon realize are far wealthier than many of us in the most important ways in life. My lessons, therefore, as I speak about Africa in general, are drawn heavily from my own experience in Kenya and a number of other countries regarding the democratic trajectory on which we are currently embarked. This is Africa's century. We are the last continent to apparently line up its economic ducks in a row in a context where some argue that there is enough of a middle class to deliver on the policies necessary to move us into a middle-income status. Africa's economy was the size of Russia's in 2008, all of Africa's, $1.6 trillion. And the growth across the continent has been at booming levels, really since 1998. And only a third of this growth has been driven by the extractive industries. The rest of it is in services, transportation, infrastructure, agriculture, and other sectors. So the economy has been doing well. This is combined, in Kenya's case, with a youth bulge. In Kenya, 75% of the population is below 34 years of age and 50% below the age of 18. A giant workforce that is the healthiest, best educated, and most globalized in Kenya's history. Then there has been the discovery of untapped natural resources on an unprecedented scale. A powerful narrative of Africa rising has captured the global imagination. And big money has rushed to the continent to take advantage of the rich pickings before the field becomes too crowded. The key challenges confronting Africa's rise are deepening authoritarianism that I have seen described as the resilience of the past, identity-based fragmentation along ethnic and religious lines, corruption and deepening economic income inequality that's easily politicized, mobilized, and at the most extreme, ultimately militarized. Indeed, improving economic prospects have been accompanied not with an expansion of political space, but with a shrinkage of political space. This contrasts with the last spurt of democratic expansion in the early 1990s. In actual fact, elites have been able to use the political independence afforded by the new affluence to embark on a reversal of some of the hard-won freedoms of the last 2 decades in terms of space for the media, civil society, and the political opposition to function. Rapidly deepening impunity with regard to corruption has caused Kenya, for example, to slide still lower at the bottom rung of the world's most corrupt countries, according to Transparency International's 2014 index. Our yardstick in Kenya is usually that we always beat Nigeria. We are less corrupt than Nigeria. This time we beat the Nigerians, so that wasn't. But you know, Kenya's case is unique, however, as we had a near civil war following a rigged election in 2007. And in 2013, the controversially elected president and deputy president, who we voted in while we were still under indictment for war crimes at the International Criminal Court. The subsequent democratic reversals and deepening impunity with regard to corruption are set in this unique, self-fulfilling context. So while the macroeconomic measures of progress have been positive, however, poverty has been replaced by a far more volatile condition of widespread inequality. At the same time, the widespread phenomena of growth without jobs and democratic voice without accountability has become increasingly apparent. It is ironic that Kenya and a host of African countries faces the kind of political challenges and opportunities they do at a time when an economic takeoff is apparently imminent. In the short term, instead, we have Africa uprising, because the truth is the region has started to convulse. Critically, we now acknowledge the extent to which violence is being used as a political tool by elites. From Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, in the Maghreb, to Nigeria, Mali, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burkina Faso, Kenya, Mali, Central African Republic, Guinea-Bissau, Niger, I can go on and on. We are learning that the rising, the growing up, will be extremely painful, at least in the short term. The truth is, democracy has reigned supreme since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But while totalitarianism has taken a seemingly permanent setback, authoritarianism never really went away. We wanted it to, but its resurgence today is partly fed by the fact that the current elites have learned how to manipulate geopolitical realities better than their predecessors. There is a sophistication to the authoritarian slippage that is underway now. So don't go looking for Idi Amin Dada or Mobutu Sese Seko or the like. Today's autocrats wear Gucci. They studied here in the West. They employ the best spin doctors and speak in a language that uses the words that have global agency, accountability, transparency, good governance, etc. These new and improved deluxe models of authoritarianism have some of the characteristics of what some this was analysis that we were doing with friends over the past 1 year. Some of the characteristics that come at the beginning of a fascist state being created, just the kind of sophistication that is being put to the authoritarian tendencies that we have. There are a number of these that I shall just mention that are drawn from Dr. Lawrence Britt's 2003 exposition on the same. First of all, one sees regimes that continually conjure up nationalistic narratives, making use of patriotic mottos, flags, songs, and paraphernalia. In Kenya, it's a little band with a flag on it that people wear. Secondly, reversals on the human rights front. Our head of state, speaking at a national day at the end of last year, basically said democracy should not be allowed to interfere with security. So this disdain for human rights becomes quite prevalent. At the same time, because of the fear of enemies and the need for security, the middle class tends to look the other way as extrajudicial methods are used to deal with these security threats. Since 2012, dozens of Kenyan Muslim clerics and imams have been assassinated, some in broad daylight, and by people who they know. At the same time, hundreds of young men associated with outlawed gangs have also disappeared and been murdered, and we have lists of their names. This condition has been normalized. Thirdly, the identification of enemies, scapegoats, communities, groups that we can say that is the enemy. And this comes to Kenya at a time when Muslims came to Kenya centuries ago. The Chinese were in Kenya in the 13th century. The capital of Oman was in Zanzibar for a long time. We have a very tolerant culture with regard to Islam and religious relations. But today, increasingly, it is Kenya's Muslims who are seen as part of the problem. So we have sectarianism building in a society where this issue was not a problem before. It's only over the last 1.5 years, and it is deeply unfortunate. Fourthly, we've seen an increasing pushing to the forefront of the supremacy of the military, whether it's the president wearing a military garb often, whether it's the military being deployed for internal security purposes and as political advisors. This has become an increasing trend. Fourthly, the media space has shrunk fairly dramatically. As we speak, yesterday, yet another blogger was arrested. We had a blogger, I mean just a blogger, not a newspaper editor, but somebody who writes a blog, was arrested and charged. And late last year, we had one who was imprisoned for two years, essentially for insulting the president. Now, having a democracy where you can't insult the president is sort of a bit of a contradiction. And once you hold yourself up into public office, that happens. And I can say that because I know I have been the subject of much abuse, which continues to this day. Fifthly, we've seen an obsession with national security. It is discussed ad nauseum, but not with solutions being offered, but just whipping us into fear. Sixthly, and I think importantly in Kenya's case, is the intertwining of government and elements of the organized religion. This affected the capacity of the church to play the role of an honest arbiter during the crisis of 2007-2008, when we had the meltdown after the elections, and they've never really recovered. The current regime was elected after a campaign in 2012 that saw rallies dubbed prayer meetings officiated by bishops and other clergy. Then, in addition to that, we've seen a situation where corporate power is protected at all costs. And you have a situation where there is no difference between the ruling political elite and the private sector in entire chunks of the economy. Additionally, labor power is suppressed. And then, in addition to that, there's a disdain for intellectuals and the arts and civil society. In Kenya, the regime supporters have actually crafted a narrative which describes elements of civil society as the evil society, with a big chart with photographs on it. For my sins, I'm one of the faces in that picture, and I think after this talk, it will be even more prominent. But that wasn't there before. This very orchestrated, focused, singling out of individuals within civil society for alienation and attack. Additionally, a raft of legislation to manage and muzzle civil society has been orchestrated. Then, this is all accompanied by rampant cronyism and corruption. In Kenya's case, the corruption that we have now is so rampant that the security organs are unable to prosecute their core mandates effectively. We've seen a similar kind of development in Nigeria, unfortunately, when what used to be Africa's most powerful military, the Nigerian army, even during authoritarian times, it was a Nigerian army that was sent into Sierra Leone, into Liberia, to do peacekeeping. They would also do a lot of other things, but they would bring a semblance of initial peace to a very, very difficult and barbaric situation. But I'm sure you've read and you've heard about Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, and the fact that we have cases of entire garrisons of the Nigerian army running away from an informal group like Boko Haram. Unimaginable for the Nigerian army, the one that was our fallback. We will fight to the last Nigerian, it was the African saying, for that to be happening. So that also tells a story about the impact of corruption on these organs that are supposed to be used to effect an authoritarian state. Additionally to this, and this is especially the case since 2003, 2004, there's an overlap in terms of corruption between drugs, terrorism, human trafficking, money laundering, environmental corruption. By that I mean the trade in horns and tusks of elephants, general corruption proceeds, and illicit finance generally. Illicit finance and corruption, which had been informalized in the 1990s when Transparency International, the World Bank, and the international communities were seized with this issue, has been reformalized in the recent decade and a half. So illicit finance is now once again going through regular banks, law firms, real estate companies, etc. The service sector has become essential to the movement of illicit flows of finance. It wasn't very much, that had tapered off in the 1990s. And finally, we have a situation of increasingly fraudulent elections become a characteristic, so manipulated elections. Elections that are very close, very contentious, and are full of problems. And Kenya's last two elections are a case in point. That is a Kenyan case. There are common denominators that are becoming apparent across the continent vis-a-vis the democratic reversals that we face. First, we've seen a boom in the extractive sector. The troubling reality is that in the past, the discovery of onshore and other high-value minerals in Africa has led to instability and violence. And I draw the distinction between onshore and offshore. Onshore, you discover oil onshore, it's usually more problematic than when you discover it in the sea somewhere. Because, brutally put, no ethnic group owns it when it's in the sea there. But when it's on your land, it requires a lot of politics to be able to deal with it. These resources, it has meant that elites have the resources to consolidate their hold on power, less encumbered than before by international norms regarding human rights and good governance. Secondly, and I speak frankly, and I'm in this moderated context of Stanford University, the war against terror has led to major geopolitical changes that haven't helped the democratic cause. Authoritarian leaders often make more efficient partners in the war against terror. They're better at chasing down terrorists, and I'll talk a bit about that later. And the war against terror isn't cold, it's hot, asymmetrical, and existential in many respects. Thirdly, powerful but well-organized developmentalist authoritarian regimes like China, to a less extent Russia, are in the ascendance. They are rich and offering an alternative to the Western liberal model. The West, on the other hand, would seem to have lost their confidence and interest to, or also become exhausted. They've been pummeled by the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, which are increasingly assertive and self-confident in their posture globally, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the blowback from that, and then, of course, WikiLeaks, Mr. Edward Snowden, and the fiscal cliff also here in the USA though to a less extent because it was not really understood in much of the developing world, where going broke is it's not a big deal. Salaries come late. I mean, it's not a big deal, but it happens to the U.S. We notice what happened. How can it happen? Well, it's the richest country in the world. So then people stop and think, what's happening? I mean, American civil servants are not going to be paid, not like Kenyan teachers. So it's you know, I know for Americans it's an issue, but this is the way we see it and the impact it has regarding the way we perceive the country that has been the one that has given us these beautiful ideas of liberty and freedom and democracy that we have embraced as our own. There are other enduring realities that, of course, authoritarian tendencies to once again. And I'll just say this in closing. I should like to argue these are the following. The first is the resilience of identity politics. We underrated the resilience of identity politics generally, and ethnic subnationalism and its ability to sustain patrimonial systems of governance that are inimical to the building of modern states, the rule of law, and institutions of accountability. Indeed, ethnic subnationalism, while used by elites to mobilize, cheats states of their monopoly of coercive power. So a tribe can more or less take over the government in Yemen. The end all of this is that democracies of many countries in the third world, especially in Africa, the truth is they will never look like Sweden or America or Norway. It's the truth that we've come to accept. We're coming to terms with this. The resilience of identity politics, of ethnicity and tribalism, despite economic growth, creating a middle class that should aspire to an impersonal state, means important changes are needed that I shall touch on briefly. You know, one thing that has struck me is that as states have collapsed, we've seen this fragmentation along these different lines in the Middle East, the Sunnis and the Shias. And, you know, in Iraq, I had never heard of the Al-Nasir tribe or the Al-Ubaids, the Abu Sahils, the Yazidis. We know them all now. We've seen this sort of fragmentation take place as states collapse. Because of this, we must accept the continuing huge currency of culture and identity that overwhelm democratic traditions, institutions, and processes. The reaction is a zero-sum game of patrimonial politics that can be stagnating, turbulent, and at times violent. Secondly, I talked about grand corruption. Indeed, looting is back, partly because we can. The checks and balances that were there have reduced since around 2003. And the international community has lost its power and diplomatic leverage to do anything about it. Civil society and media can be co-opted, confused, and intimidated. The opposition can be bought off and disassembled by elites using state resources. The China effect, quote unquote, has also been destabilizing on this front, as theirs is an authoritarian but efficient state model. Attempts to copy it in Africa lead to patrimonial, increasingly unstable states as they attempt to impose governance models that are completely at variance with the aspirations of the majority of their people. The financial crisis in the West in 2008 also exposed the reach of graft and how hard it is to uproot. Thirdly, the democratic setbacks that are kicking off now around the world have and can be attributed partly to a failure to build effective modern states. I should like to argue that in many parts of the world, the frustration with state building is caused by the fact that we are still embroiled in a prior nation-building phase. Nation building is about a more nebulous software type of range of issues, like those that flow so often from the mouths of many in the Middle East on both sides of the war against terror: dignity, honor, respect. Nation building is about tradition over rules, practices over processes, the oral over the written, the collective consciousness over the logical. Building a state in a low-trust, ethnically heterogeneous environment is difficult if you don't build a nation first. Nation-building efforts that are understood as such, even if not articulated explicitly, confer legitimacy on elites who carry them out and the states that they craft. Nations are built by leaders and elites, sometimes to save themselves from war, accountability, or loss of status and privilege, to avoid crisis and uncertainty about the future. It's about the software and not the hardware. So one can ask, at what point does the law become a pragmatic tool? At what point does the law become a pragmatic tool for managing each other's behavior for an elite? This requires a meritocratic enforcement that's unbiased and perceived to be totally unbiased. The one public good that's key is trust. It comes from keeping promises and inspiring hope that things will improve in the majority of the population, questioning the durability of current unpleasant realities. This creates legitimate authority. In a polarized context where the prevailing political culture especially has been one of patrimonialism, this is more important than delivering other public goods like roads, hospitals, and schools. Because in those contexts, people ask first, where is the school being built and for who? So you have a development project, you spend a huge amount of money on it, and yet you wonder how come the politics isn't working out. Billions of dollars are being spent on quote-unquote development. But the question that people are asking in their hearts is, it's development for who? For which community? For which group? This resilience of identity politics. There are certain characteristics that come to play when nation building is taking place. One of them is collective trauma. A nation that has suffered collective trauma, it could be a coup, civil war, a genocide, whatever, can help create, with the right leadership, a sense of that, we don't want that to happen again. I think it partly explains, people ask, how come, despite the horrors that we saw in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and other places, how come their democracies, no matter how imperfect, have been sustainable thus far? And I think it's the horrors of their own past that has helped create a bond amongst the people that they don't even need to talk about. Secondly, nation building often means deliberate counterintuitive policies that forges new identities. And I always use the case here of the Tanzanian city of Dodoma. I think Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, was one of Africa's great nation builders, not a state builder, but a nation builder. Much like Thomas Sankara, president of Burkina Faso. And one of the things that Nyerere did is that to unite the country, he decided to move the capital to build the capital of Tanzania in the center of Tanzania, in the middle of nowhere. I've been there 3 times. And it didn't make any economic sense. It didn't, it's the middle of nowhere. And it was totally counterintuitive. But it was a nation building effort, one of many that he implemented. And I think that, I still argue with friends about it because I think it was a special move and it shows how counterintuitive nation building can be. Economists and policy experts may shake their heads about it and the development industry may hate it, but nation building often is counterintuitive in that way. Thirdly, an articulated skepticism with regard to commonly accepted international ideological, political, and social framework on the part of the elite. When they express that skepticism to a population, again, it helps build that legitimacy that I'm talking about. I should like to close on a more positive closing note. I had a whole list of innovations that are possible in nation building and state building in Africa, especially at this time when we have a resurgence of authoritarianism. But the most optimistic note with regard to democracy in Africa right now is the fact that regardless of the current condition of reversals, the majority of Africans remain totally committed to democracy and freedom. Even though the democratic space in some cases is shrinking. And it reminds me of something that a long-term dictator of Kenya, former President Moi, he ran Kenya for 24 years. And at the point he was pushed to accept multi-party politics in Kenya, he warned the Kenyan people. He said, you people, you are working together with the West to push me to allow these many parties. Once this genie is out of the bottle, you cannot put it back in. And that remains true now more than ever before. There are those who are trying to put it back in. Putting it back in will be a bloody process, and I don't think it will work. Africans remain committed to the freedoms. We enjoy them. We relish them. And even though we see reversals from time to time, one remains confident because of the majority of the population's enduring commitment to the freedoms that they have come to love and enjoy. Thank you very much.
You can stay up there. Field some questions. We have a few minutes, and Mr. Githongu has actually agreed to field a few questions. I can say that listening to you talk and Larry's introduction about that this is certainly a global citizen, and I think you listen to him and he leaves no doubt that we are an interconnected global society. So I want to open it up there are two microphones. Jim has a microphone, and I think Kristen has a microphone. If any of you have questions for our distinguished visitor. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alex Orsola. I work for the Center for Effective Global Action at UC Berkeley. And we try to basically look for rigorous evidence on what works and doesn't work on development to really bring effectiveness to our policies and programs. So my question is, even when we have evidence, which is a huge problem finding that evidence of what's working and it's not working, even when we had it for governance programs, what do you think would work in the context of Kenya? I myself come from Spain, where corruption is also institutionalized at some levels, and you're almost the dumb person when you pay your taxes, and everyone kind of rewards you for not doing it. So when you live in that culture where corruption is almost seen as a normal thing, how do you break it? Thank you.
Take a couple of questions and then, or shall I start now?
You want to take a few and then, okay, yeah, we can take a few.
Bwana Githongu, welcome.
Thank you.
Washington Osiro, I'm from Kenya. My question to you is, how do you explain the transformation of an Amherst-educated politician becoming the authoritarian despot that Mr. Kenyatta turned out to be?
Question. Jess?
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Jess. I'm a graduate student in anthropology working on Angola. I just wanted to ask, to what extent do you think the BRIC countries offer an aspirational alternative in terms of development across the continent? I'd be interested, particularly in terms of corruption and the models that they offer there as well. Thank you.
You want to take one more?
Yeah, okay, I'll take those.
Okay.
Maybe I'll start with the last question first, and I think the BRIC countries, especially Brazil and India, do offer an aspirational model in terms of dealing with corruption. When one looks at especially the efforts of President Lula and also currently, and the fact that India is the world's largest democracy, grappling with in very, their own very unique way, where they had basically an uprising from below, over the last 2-3 years, where people said enough. And I think that also in some way contributed to the kind of election outcome that they had. We haven't seen the end of it yet. We'll see how that plays out. This is a messy process. And so it is, there are examples there of that used very, very effectively in other developing countries. The Chinese model as well. I remember 5 years ago, just reading the Chinese National 5-year development plan, and was very impressed to see that the Chinese Communist Party, which came at it from a totally different angle, their analysis was that unless they dealt with corruption, it was a threat, it posed a threat to their continued hold on power and towards maintaining a harmonious, peaceful society. And the new leadership in China has gone after corruption very hard, but in a way that only if you have a very efficient, non-democratic system can you do it. Now, the Chinese state is very unique. And I was reading the other day, China has the oldest state bureaucracy in the world, almost 2,000 years old. So they can do it. Now, some of our countries, the capacity to pull that off isn't there. So I wouldn't ask our judges and policemen to start shooting corrupt people, because a lot of people will get shot probably who weren't involved. So I would say, hold on, we need more checks and balances before we do this. One gets a sense that in China it's a much tighter system, but more importantly, it emerges out of their own historical experience. It is part of their culture. It is not something which is comes from outside. It's from within. It may have its controversies even within, but there are mechanisms that seem to be self-correcting there. But now, Sindo, you asked the Kenyan question about what happened in Kenya. I think choices have consequences. We had an election, and the president and deputy president who were elected were at that time indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. So actually, we should not be surprised by the trajectory things have taken, given that kind of, that is the seed that has become the plant that is Kenya right now. Finally, the issue of corruption and culture is a good one, especially given, for me, watching very closely the recent elections in Greece and how the Greeks have elected a radical left-wing party, and how European and South European politics is changing, including in Spain. People are thinking that it may go in the noise is being made of a similar nature as to what we heard in Greece. It's been politically incorrect to talk about corruption and culture together. It was particularly opposed, and I speak this as somebody who's been involved with Transparency International for a long time, because at the start of the anti-corruption advocacy movement in the early 90s, there are those who wanted to say that corruption is in African culture. And so we said, no, it is not cultural. Yet, with the passage of time and seeing what we've seen with the financial crisis in the West and difficulties in other countries, one is forced to admit that dealing with corruption requires one to take a long, hard look regarding the underlying cultural issues in any society, and attitudes that override the processes, the laws. You can have something in writing about taxes, but everyone knows that if I don't give you a receipt, it's okay. And it becomes normal, and it becomes like this. I watched it in the UK when they had a big crisis over MPs and their expenses. And that's a very mature democracy. And of course, there was a big crackdown. MPs were in trouble for charging $20 for renting a movie, or they weren't supposed to do that. But the question I ask myself is that how come so many got caught up in it? You join a system, and I look across, and both people on both sides of me are doing the same thing. So you sort of first ask, is this the way it works here? I said, yeah, that's the way it works there. I said, okay. And you join the gravy train, as it were. And it takes both policy, but leadership and enforcement to deal with that, to recognize that that is a problem that needs to be addressed. And that, yes, it means facing up to cultural hang-ups that we all have in various ways. There's no country without it, to be able to address those issues. So yes, I'm agreeing with you, but in terms of how do you measure it, I think we're just at the start of beginning to explore that. It's been politically incorrect up to now to talk about culture and corruption together. Once it arrived in Europe, now we can all talk about it, because it's not only an African problem or Asian problem. So now we start finding answers.
So John made my job really easy by rapid fire questions. I think we have time for one more question. June.
Hi, I'm a Kenyan in my mid-30s who witnessed the election violence and have not recovered. And I'm a member of a generation that I thought was going to sort of change the tide that had come with dictatorship. But now my peers are involved in this identity politics, and I feel very dejected. And I have sort of lost this love I had for my country. Do you have any hope that we can turn around this in this generation or for my generation? Or do you think we've lost it?
Okay. I'll go with that.
Yeah.
I don't think we've lost it. I think that when I look at my own case, when I joined government and the expectations that we had and what we started doing, we had multiple programs. Some still exist, some were scrapped on the anti-corruption front. And I think, maybe I'm just growing old. We over-expected in the beginning and didn't take enough time to understand exactly what we were trying to change. And Kenya, sorry to focus on it, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa are unique in the continent of Africa, Algeria to a certain extent, where the states that were built were created for the purposes of maintaining in power a small minority elite. In South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, there were settlers, basically. So it's a small, very aggressive state, uses disproportionate violence. And I'm sure if you look at the post-election violence, a majority of people died in Western Kenya. Most of them were shot by the police. That goes back to the 1940s. So, as I said, the resilience of the past is something that we hadn't counted on. Now, there are opportunities, the opportunities that we've seen where this has changed dramatically in Africa. Thomas Sankara did it. Nyerere also did it. I believe to a certain extent Museveni also, when he started, caused tremendous change with the right leadership that understands the context and is also confronted with the people who are exhausted with the current situation. Then those changes are can happen because the population. By the time Museveni was going through I met President Museveni before he became president. He was a rebel, and he was in Nairobi fundraising. And I went to a function where he spoke for 7 hours, and I was extremely, extremely impressed. He gave a history of Africa, what he's going to do for Uganda, and I was completely sold. And then he took over. He had this 10-point agenda, and I was completely sold. And he did it, and rescued the country from a very ugly time. So I would not lose hope in Kenya's case. We've gone into reverse. I always look at myself, and look at ourselves and our own attitudes. And we underrated, I think, just the power of this identity politics and ethnicity in our society. And we thought that if we implement a new constitution, on paper it's wonderful, but we haven't done enough nation building to be able to implement that constitution. And that's why through a whole host of subsidiary legislations over the past 1.5 years, elements of it have been being removed. So what's needed is really from all of us is eternal vigilance, number one. Number two, do not be surprised if there's another convulsion. And each one knocks a bit more sense into us. One doesn't get depressed, but one understands that, this is the ugliness. Nation building, state building is quite easy. You can gather a whole team here in Stanford and plan it all out. Medium-term expenditure frameworks, you can plan it, plot it, plan it, fund it, everything. Nation building is a grimy, difficult process with every group wants its say, and it's often blood-soaked. And we're going through that. It's accelerated, partly because of this fuel of oil that lights things up. But I think it's a process which, the beauty is that we can see it. Our father's generation, who were the first to extract these resources, which brought grief to so many African countries, didn't know. They thought it was manna from heaven, black gold from the ground, given by God. Now we know. I had been praying for a long time that we don't discover oil until we've gotten our heads right, until we got the nation building side right. You can have all, because you can write laws, you can do all the state things and do them right, but if the nation isn't, if the software isn't working, it doesn't matter how much hardware you put in there. And my concern with the oil sector is that these are the strongest stomachs in the private sector. It doesn't matter if there's civil war, they'll still be pumping oil out, and while people are killing each other around the oil. But so it seems that God has given us a decline in the price of oil, which has slowed things down a little bit. So we have a short time to try and sort ourselves out while the excitement around oil has died down a little bit.
So we at the Haas Center are so thrilled to have you join us, and at CDDRL as well. I just want to point out, I know that there are other questions in the audience. We are going to be fortunate to have you in residence for some time. And I want to actually ask Jim to stand up, Jim Murray. Mr. Gathongo is going to be working very closely with Jim, and if you're interested in connecting with Mr. Gathongo while he's here, please connect with Jim, because he can help do that. We really do see this visit as an opportunity to connect a wide range of faculty, staff, and students and community partners to this great opportunity. And so I want to thank you. I can't imagine living what you've lived through in retaining and being so resilient and yet so optimistic about the future. And so we're really happy to have you here. And let's one more time give Mr. Gathongo a round of applause.
Thank you very, very much.